Hi everybody, we're back again to do another session on egoism. We've done one on introduction to egoism, studying a little bit about Epicurus. Our second one was on Thomas Hobbes, and this last final session is going to be dealing with Ayn Rand. Might be a little bit more complicated. What we're going to do is try to look at Rand's general philosophy, particularly with regard to how she defines selfishness as a virtue, and then we're going to get into some of her other thoughts that are connected to egoism, and we're going to critique a little bit of egoism and hedonism at the very end of this. So as we jump in, I'm just going to give you first a little bit of a background on Rand. Real name's Elisa Rosenbaum. She was born in 1905 in Petrograd, which is St. Petersburg, Russia. Middle-class Jewish family, and she was there during the time that the Bolshevik Revolution occurred, and then she migrated to the United States, fleeing communism in 1926. If any of you have already heard of her, you may have heard of her in connection with her most famous work, which is Atlas Shrugged. She also wrote a work specifically on egoism. Not that Atlas Shrugged wasn't about egoism in a certain way. It was a novel, but the direct work that deals with egoism is a work called The Virtue of Selfishness, a new concept of egoism. And she's also associated with what's known as the Objectivist movement, which is, I guess, how you could sum up her entire philosophy, Objectivism. And then she died back in 1982. Now, as just a quick overview, Objectivism is going to entail a number of different principles and beliefs. The central concept, of course, is this concept of selfishness. So in the Virtue of Selfishness, she's going to define selfishness as a virtue and not a vice, as many people interpret it. Right? Usually when you hear the word selfish, we think, that's not a good thing. We don't want to be selfish overall when we think of how we ought to behave as human beings. But she doesn't see it this way. She actually sees it as a good thing that we should strive to be. I've got a number of quotes in this PowerPoint, so bear with me as I read through some of them, and then we'll kind of discuss little bits and pieces of them, and we'll see where she seems to maybe have some confusion, possibly in her thinking. So anyways, let's start with this quote from that particular work. The meaning ascribed in popular usage to the word selfishness is not merely wrong. It represents a devastating intellectual package deal, which is responsible for the arrested development of mankind. So she's saying that the way we use the word today, she doesn't agree with that. She wants to define it in a certain sense for her purposes. The exact meaning and dictionary definition of the word selfishness is concerned with one's own interests. This concept does not include a moral evaluation. Obviously, she's saying it's not to be evaluated as a bad thing, which is what we generally think of. She's attempting to give what she calls a dictionary definition, or an exact meaning, simply concern with one's own interest. The problem is that that definition does not address the general understanding of the word, and it does leave out some, I think, important things that belong to the definition of selfishness. So, for instance, she says it's concerned with one's own interests, but it leaves out maybe the emphasis on the only. When we think of selfishness, we tend to think it's concerned with only one's interests, regardless of how you treat others. But she doesn't use it that way. And of course, if you treat it in the sense that we normally use it, as concern only for oneself, regardless of other people, then it does bring in, of course, some moral criticism with it. Now, she's an advocate of moral egoism, not psychological egoism, as we studied before. Hopefully you remember the distinction between the two, psychological being a description of how we behave, and moral egoism being implying that this is a way that we ought to behave. So she does believe that we ought to think and behave egoistically, and she outright rejects the psychological egoism that says we can't help but do that. She does believe that we have the opportunity to act in other ways, even altruistically. Just because every action is motivated by a value or a goal that agent desires does not mean that one always acts out of selfishness. Here's her quote. And I think this is insightful. Obviously, in order to act, one has to be moved by some personal motive. One has to want, in some sense, to perform the action. The issue of an action's selfishness or unselfishness depends not on whether one wants to perform it, but on why one wants to perform it. And I think that's important to pay attention to, because a lot of time we think that because we always do what we want to do, and you could stop and think about this in analyzing your own behavior, perhaps, that at least all things being equal, even with restricted options, you're always going to pick the one you most want to engage in at any particular moment in time. And you can think to yourself, well, maybe I don't always do what I want to do. It seems like a lot of times I do choose to do something I don't want to do. For instance, when it comes to studying for a test versus going out with your friends, you may decide I'd rather go out with my friends, yet I chose to stay home and study for the test. And obviously I didn't want to do that, but if you really think about it carefully, you realize, well, it might not be the studying that you want so much as to pass the test. And you may see that passing the test is more important than going out with your friends. Therefore, you choose to do that, which again is going to be according to your greatest desire at the moment. If you weren't concerned at all for the test, then you probably would have skipped the studying and gone out with your friends. So anyways, she's kind of making a distinction here that, yeah, just because we want to do something doesn't mean that we're acting egoistically, doesn't mean that we're acting selfishly. So maybe Hobbes is wrong in that everything we do is this psychological egoism coming through. We're doing it for our own interest. She says the distinction is that the reason why you want to do it, okay, not just that you want to do it. And I think that's maybe an important distinction to make. Now, she does believe that altruism, while possible, is actually morally wrong. She actually believes it's always morally wrong, and the reason is because she believes it undermines self-esteem, and it doesn't really take seriously the individual person's human dignity. And when we first did the introduction to egoism, we gave some basic arguments for egoism that address both of these, and we'll look at least one of those again a little bit. But the idea that it undermines self-esteem is, again, the idea that when you are concerned for other people and you get involved in their business, a lot of people don't find that necessarily helpful, in that it does seem to involve intrusion in some way into our lives, and maybe hurts your pride in a certain way. So it really undermines each individual's sense of self, and of course it doesn't take seriously individual human dignity when you do that. Of course, the way she defines her terms, the same way she defines selfishness, she's going to define altruism in a certain interesting way. So do pay attention to the way she defines things, because they can, in a way, beg the question in favor of the conclusions she wants you to come to. So here's how she defines altruism. Altruism declares that any action taken for the benefit of others is good, and any action taken for one's own benefit is evil. Now stop and think for a while and ask yourself, is that actually what we say when we think of altruism, or believe when we think of altruism? And of course, altruism also involves what she considers sacrificing oneself. Quote, the ethical theory which regards man as a sacrificial animal, that's how she understands altruism. She goes on to say, holds that man has no right to exist for his own sake, that service to others is the only justification of his existence, and that self-sacrifice is the highest moral duty, virtue, and value. Now, of course, when we look at the word altruism, we don't think of just any action taken for one's own benefit to be evil. There's plenty of things that we do for our own benefit that we don't consider evil, even if we consider ourselves to be altruistic. And then you have the definition of sacrifice, which is problematic as well. For her, again, sacrifice means to surrender a higher value for a lower value, or for a non-value. And again, is that what you think of when you think of sacrifice? When you make a sacrifice of yourself, of your time, of your money, of your whatever, for some other goal, is it that we're thinking we're sacrificing something of greater value for something of less value? And if that is true, how many people actually would sacrifice if they believe the thing they're sacrificing for is of lesser value? So that's actually, I think, fairly questionable. Now, here's the problem with these definitions. Like I said, begging the question in favor of where she wants us to go, and agree with her. It's a straw man. First of all, it's a caricature of altruism, like I was just saying. No version of altruistic theory actually imply that any action for the benefit of others is good. And you could take an example here, a mad woman who drowns her babies to spare them the suffering of the world. right? Assuming that she has this concept that this is going to be a benefit for them. We don't want to think of that as an altruistic action. And of course, no version of altruism always holds that acting for one's own benefit is always evil, like I just said. We have to eat. That's for our own benefit. Getting an education, treating yourself to an ice cream, whatever you want to use as an example. We don't consider those things evil, even if you hold to an altruistic worldview. Another straw man is that she has used a false definition of sacrifice, as I just said. Most people who make sacrifices actually do so because they believe they're sacrificing something of lesser value for something of greater value. For instance, people that do some willing to die for what they think is God's will, would sacrifice their lives, which are of extraordinary value, for something that they think is ultimately more valuable, which is, God's will or something along those lines. When people sacrifice their time and their money for their children, you put your children's future as a very high value, more valuable, of course, than your own time and money and things like that. So again, it's a false definition of sacrifice that we're working with. Now, she believes that this selfishness is based on a rational principle. Rand places rationality very high in her order of, I guess you could say, virtues or values. In fact, everything is going to boil down in some ways to human rationality, as we'll see a little later when we talk about her view of human nature. But she says, always act in accordance with the hierarchy of your values and never sacrifice a greater value to a lesser one. She believes that's just a rational thing. And of course, it does seem to be a rational thing. Why would you sacrifice something of greater value for lesser value? And given Rand's definitions above, it follows that you would never be altruistic. Giving up something for a greater value is not a sacrifice, but it would be a rational action. For example, a man who risks his life to fight an oppressive regime because life under that regime would be of no value is not that act is actually not an act of sacrifice. So we can agree with her if her definition of sacrifice is correct. Nobody would ever make such a sacrifice. When it comes to morality, she does again say the genuinely moral man is not the altruistic man, but the selfish man. Because the selfish man is again pursuing rational self-interest. We're operating under the guise of reason. We're seeking what is in our own best interest. And that not only involves seeking what we want, but not compromising as we do that. Because, again, she sees compromise as a type of sacrifice. And therefore, it would be something that is irrational to do. And we must always be rational. Now, of course, self-interest, rational self-interest, is not following only one's desires. It actually involves embracing the principles that she lays out in her greater philosophy as absolutes. And again, as I said, objectivism not only has a place for selfishness, that's the core value, but it also includes commitment to things like capitalism, minimal government, refusal to accept obligation to the less fortunate, and things along those lines. The reason is going to be our only source of knowledge by which we can judge values and guide us in our actions. Now, what of this value? What of this ultimate value? We need to bring that into the discussion, egoism and value. Of course, the ultimate value for Rand is your individual life. And of course, she's going to reject the fact-value distinction, which we looked at several lectures ago. We said, with the fact-value distinction being a very big problem for ethical discussion and morality and moral philosophy in general, is there a way around the fact-value distinction? We kind of looked at it, took an Aristotelian approach to see how you can kind of resolve the distinction or even unite facts and values in a certain way. And you can think for yourself whether or not Rand is successful in doing this. But she is going to try to unite values and facts in a certain way. So she says value is actually based on a metaphysical fact, on an unalterable condition of man's existence. And now that unalterable condition is what she calls the struggle to survive. This is something that is unalterable in our existence. This is what we do as living beings. We're always in this constant struggle to survive, because life can only be kept in existence by some kind of self-sustaining action. Now, of course, the goal of that action, right, as we struggle to survive, the goal of struggling to survive is going to be life, right, to preserve our own life. And therefore, that is going to be the ultimate value or ultimate standard of value, since that is the ultimate goal of that particular action. So in a way, there's a bit of a teleology built into this, and that the struggle for life is goal-directed. We could decide for ourselves whether or not this is going to be sufficient in getting where she wants us to get. She says an organism's life is its standard of value. That which furthers its life is good, and of course that which threatens its life is evil. Okay, so again, she is going to bring in value judgments based on the objective fact of human struggling to survive. I'm saying this pretty poorly, but I think you are following me. At least I hope you're following me. She goes on and she starts talking about individual rights. And I think this is where it gets a little bit fuzzy, at least from my perspective. And maybe I don't understand Rand as well as I should. But she's going to start talking about rights as a type of value. And I can see that we can classify it as a type of value. We just have to be careful. Because she's then going to try to connect values and needs. And we've already done this. We've seen that Aristotle actually does this as well, though he makes very specific distinctions in what needs are, different types of needs there are. And we can actually look at that, I think, later in this PowerPoint. The values, again, are derived from needs. She says, the first step is to assert man's right to a moral existence. That is to recognize his need of a moral code to guide the course of fulfillment of his own life. So here she's making this connection, which is why I put this with the equal sign, that a right to moral existence is the same thing as a need for a moral code. Now, if you don't reject the fact-value distinction, if you're open to the idea that there is a distinction between facts and values and understand that the naturalistic philosophy is problematic, perhaps she is making one of those errors here in her reasoning. And you could ask whether or not she can derive the concept of a right, which is a type of value, from a need, which happens to be a factual situation. This seems to be what she's doing. But like I said, that's not necessarily a bad thing. However, when we talk about rights, you've got to be very careful. Even if we can connect needs to rights, needs to values, it doesn't mean we can connect needs to rights in the same way. Rights seem to be related to values. It might be a subcategory of values, but that can be debatable. When we talk about rights, maybe in greater political philosophy, there's a little bit more subtle distinction in how you have to understand it. And I think one of the big problems in the modern era is that people don't understand what a right actually is. And we spend very little time actually trying to define that. And you could ask yourself, based on her philosophy here, if you need X, does that automatically mean that you have a right to X, whatever that is? Because we could think of needs for things like a drink, for a meal, for health care. Maybe even I feel a need to force my will upon somebody else. Now, of course, you can classify some of these needs as actual needs, right desires, as Aristotle would put it. Other things maybe just seem to be needs. They might be more like wants or acquired desires, as Aristotle would put it. But the question is, obviously, the fact that I need a drink means that the drink has value to me, that it would be good for me. But the idea of me having a right to that drink is something that might go beyond kind of the need-value connection. I might have the right to pursue the drink, but we tend to think that human rights stop at a certain point where they start to make demands upon other people and their freedom. If somebody else has to supply something for me, I don't seem to have a right to that thing anymore. Again, with food, I have a need for food, and maybe I have a right to pursue food, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I've got a right to demand that food be given to me by somebody else that has purchased it for themselves, even given the fact that I might not have money to purchase it and they may have the money to purchase it, because then again, I'm infringing on the freedom of an individual outside of myself. It seems our needs are kind of entailed with what I'm able to do of my own power and for my own self. And of course, that brings up an interesting conversation when it comes to the discussion of whether healthcare is an actual right among human beings. because you can again think that healthcare is something that needs to be provided for you by people that have studied medicine. Okay, and again, you can imagine a world where nobody studied medicine and nobody has the training to provide health care. And we may very well need a doctor in such a world, but we can't demand, obviously, something to be given to us on those basis. So again, distinction in how we define needs is kind of, or rather rights, is very important. And I don't think she's making any particular distinction here. Anyways, the basis of all rights, she says here, there's only one fundamental right, which is a right to one's own life. Now, all other rights would be derived from this main right, this basic right, this fundamental right. So we can call these subsidiary rights, such as the right to property or the right to self-defense, which she does believe we have, or the right to take action to achieve happiness, and you can go on from there. Now, where do these rights come from? She says, of course, these rights come from man's own nature. And we'll see what she means by that in a little bit, because it's a little bit questionable if she actually holds to the idea of a nature in the same way that maybe Aristotle does. The source of man's rights is not divine law, but the law of identity. A is A. If you've studied a logic class, this is one of the three fundamental laws of logic, the law of identity. So man is man would be an example of the law of identity. And she says the rights are connected to that somehow. Rights are conditions of existence required by man's nature for his proper survival. Therefore, rights for her are inherent, since they're built into man as man, and they're also inalienable. You can't take them away, or you take away, again, man's humanity. The same rights are held individually by every man, by all men, and at all times. So, a very strong view of this idea of inherent and inalienable rights. Now, the implication seems to be that since man needs his own life, therefore he has a right to his own life. Again, it could be an is-ought problem. If you accept that, perhaps you're willing to accept that. If we have any rights at all, our right to life seems to be a fundamental one. But because she believes that these rights are absolutely inalienable, they can never be taken away, which brings up some questions as to what role the government could ever have in taking various rights from us, right? Other rights that follow subsidiary rights, such as like property, freedom, etc. Are there ever times when those could be taken? And of course, the right to life. If the right to life is absolutely inalienable, then there could be no such thing as a death penalty. And you can probably make a case against the death penalty based on that kind of hard view of inalienable rights. Not everybody does that. Other problems that we could look at, the value, of course, is based on an unalterable condition of existence, which is this struggle to survive. Now, it's not just human beings, of course, that are in this constant struggle to survive. That principle should apply equally to all non-human life, in which case the same rights she would bestow upon man, we could argue are the same for other animals and other types of living organisms within the world as well. And then, of course, then there is the big question of how you actually can derive any factual claim simply from the law of identity. I mean, the law of identity conceptually is kind of empty. There are no rights, I don't think, can be logically deduced from the mere fact that man is a man. It's a kind of a tautology, like I said, that is kind of conceptually empty when it comes to ethics. I'm not sure exactly how she's trying to make that connection. Going on a little bit further, I'll talk about some other aspects of her philosophy, and then I'll get back to this issue of human nature. But we mentioned in her Objectivism, it's not just this idea of the fundamental principle of selfishness, but you have to accept as absolute the other principles, which include things like capitalism. So I'll just say a little bit on capitalism, since she is incredibly famous for her stance on laissez-faire capitalism. She says that capitalism, of course, is deduced from selfishness via this concept of individual human rights. And I think one of the big criticisms that modern people have of capitalism is they accuse people of being selfish, that capitalism just is a selfish economic system. I don't think all capitalists would agree with that, but you could point to Rand as making this connection very obvious. If one wishes to uphold individual rights, one must realize that capitalism is the only system that can uphold and protect them. Those who advocate laissez-faire capitalism are the only advocates of man's rights. A lot of people would place her into the camp of political libertarianism, very different from the libertarianism that we looked at when we talked about the free will and determinism debate. Because again, libertarianism in a political sense emphasizes this idea of self-ownership, self-responsibility, implies that rights to private property, free market capitalism, minimal state interference in one's life, and so on. And Rand, though she's often grouped as a libertarian, would have objected to being classified that way because she actually condemned libertarianism as being a threat to freedom and capitalism and other things, because she believed that libertarianism has a tendency towards anarchy, and she believed it doesn't have a strong moral or philosophical foundation. Yet, a lot of people do nonetheless group Objectivism, her philosophy, with at least some form of libertarianism, though we would call it maybe a right-leaning libertarianism, a very conservative form of libertarianism, because they do hold a lot of the same principles. Again, along with the capitalist aspect is the principle of minimal government. She does say that there are only certain proper functions for government. Government should not be overly large. She said the only proper moral purpose of government is to protect man's rights, which means to protect him from physical violence, to protect his right to his life, to his own liberty, to his own property, and to the pursuit of his own happiness. And without property rights, no other rights are really possible. She goes on and says, the proper functions of a government fall into three broad categories, all of them involving the issue of physical force and the protection of men's rights. The police, to protect men from criminals; the armed services, to protect men from foreign invaders; the law courts, to settle disputes among men according to objective laws. Control beyond the minimal, right? A government overly large, has too much control, is going to result in a loss of individual rights. And of course, conservatives today can actually agree with a lot of this basic stuff, that it does slowly infringe on more and more human freedoms, if nothing else. Now, to allow government's control beyond the minimal is to surrender the principle of inalienable individual rights and to substitute for it the principle of the government's unlimited arbitrary power, which obviously is a bad thing in Rand's point of view. The government, she believes, can only use force in the condition of retaliation and only against those who initiate it. It doesn't have the right ever to use initiatory force. The idea of loss of personal rights, she says the only proper moral purpose of government is to protect man's rights, which means to protect him from physical violence. And then she says there's only one way to violate rights, and that's with the use of physical force. And here, of course, we might be able to pick out some problems in the way she is defining violation of rights by physical force, or the use of physical force. Here are the problems. Rand doesn't give a justification for distinguishing really between initiatory force and retaliatory force. She says the government has the right to use retaliatory force, but never initiatory force. Yet she does make a distinction between murder and self-defense. As we saw before, you have the right to self-defense. And it just assumes that there is a distinction, even though she never spells it out. Also, if all men have inalienable rights, how can you actually make that distinction? Right, if these are rights that cannot be taken away, then what's the difference of using physical force in an initiatory way or in a retaliatory way? It would still seem to violate the same inalienable rights in either case. Also, the violation of rights, she says, is only by physical force. And that seems strange because it would imply that there are a number of other things that do not use violence that because they don't use violence would therefore not be violation of rights. And you can group things like, blackmail, fraud, pollution, breach of contract, child neglect, adultery, theft, libel, and on you go, that those are not violation of rights because they're not connected with physical violence or physical force. Fallaciously, she's making an error here, I think. She concludes that all initiatory force is a violation of rights, which is the fallacy of the converse, right? If all violation of rights is by initiated physical force, which she states, she's then concluding that all initiated physical force is therefore a violation of rights, and you just can't reverse that. Logically speaking, that would be the same as saying all dogs are mammals, therefore all mammals are dogs. It's fundamentally the same logical error to conclude that just because all violations of human rights are by initiated physical force doesn't mean that all initiated physical force, again, are going to be a violation of human rights. It just doesn't follow, yet she erroneously makes that implication. Now, I mentioned we were going to be talking a little bit about Rand's view of human nature, so let's take a look at her view of human nature, because it really does diverge a little bit from the Aristotelian view, even though she starts with what seems like the Aristotelian view when she talks about man being a rational animal. Now, by an act of his will, a being can choose to become human or subhuman. It starts to sound a little bit more existentialist in that our existence is going to precede our essence. So we, in a way, have this paramount freedom to choose, again, maybe whether we're going to be rational or not, whether we're going to be human or subhuman through an act of the free will. And we already saw that that could be a problem with this existentialist view of things. In other words, that man is a man by choice. In other words, we acquire our nature. We're not actually born with it. And I don't think Aristotle would agree with that, even though, again, rationality is how he defines human people, the rational animal. So man can choose to be or not be human. And the way you choose not to be human would be through things like not being rational. If we abandon our rationality, we abandon our humanity. Or by initiating physical force, violence, things like that, which he would also consider irrational and therefore jeopardize our human nature in the process. And that might be the way she's trying to reconcile, the ideas of being able to employ self-defense and punishment, while at the same time preserving this idea of inalienable rights. Because if you think about the implications, rights supposedly are inalienable. You can't take them away. Yet human nature, which again is the basis for those rights, is something that is alienable. In other words, we can choose to not be human. And of course, man can't lose his rights, but he can lose his humanity. And of course, if he loses his humanity, then the rights should follow along with that. So maybe it's through the use of violence where we give up our humanity, therefore we give up this inalienable right not to be punished, and so on. So that might be her way around. Another implication of this particular view that may be disturbing for some is it would imply that some people who look human are not necessarily human beings. Because again, you could choose not to be human by choosing not to be rational. Or if you don't have the ability to be rational, perhaps that also qualifies as you lacking a humanity. And of course, she was open to abortion of the fetus, probably on the same grounds. But again, infants, the mentally handicapped, the question could always be, if they're lacking that human rationality, does that mean that they don't have a human nature? And all who do not choose to think conceptually, of course, would then be not human. Now, the is-ought problem, over and over again, she doesn't really seem to think there is an is-ought problem. And even with Aristotle, we said there probably isn't a real big distinction. So I want to talk a little bit about this connection between facts and values. No statement about values can be logically deduced from a fact. That's the general idea with the fact-value distinction. Unless, all right, and this is again where Aristotle would come in and saying, facts again can be connected back with values in a certain context. So values cannot be logically deduced from facts except in the situation where we presuppose that there's a general teleological metaphysics in which there are either one, goals or purposes that are built into nature, or two, perhaps supernatural goals that are driving nature. Now, Aristotle held to the first, right? He believed that there are goals and purposes that are actually built into nature, that there's a particular teleology in the natural world. Aquinas, who we're going to study later, actually holds to both of these. Being an Aristotelian, he agrees that there are goals and purposes inherent in the natural world, but he also held to the concept of supernatural goals driving nature, being a Christian philosopher. So the Thomist understanding, referring again to Aquinas, the Thomistic understanding of the word ought is going to be a means, rather I should say ought means it's a precondition that must be fulfilled in attaining one's end. Okay, so when we say somebody ought to do something, it means that thing is a precondition for attaining our end. The divine command theorist, of course, has a different view of ought, and we haven't looked at divine command theory. That'll be the next lecture, but divine command theory believes in ought just is a command of God. Okay? And the accepted way to deduce values from facts is to place a thing in its teleological concept, where it has values that are built in. To say X serves its intended purpose is a way of saying X is therefore good, because we're connecting, again, objective factual purposes with, again, the value judgments that we make on them. And I may have used the analogy before of a knife, right? If a knife has a purpose to cut, the knife is sharp, cuts well, we can make the value judgment that it's a good knife, whereas a knife that doesn't have those qualities, might be dull, can't do its job, we would consider that to be a bad knife. So again, the telos of a thing, the purpose of a thing, fundamentally links facts to values in a certain way. And we can question whether Rand is actually successfully giving us a teleological concept. The only time when she gets close, I believe, is when she talks about the survival, the struggle to survive, having a particular goal in mind of again, preservation of life. Anyways, that's really all I wanted to say about Rand. Just give you a kind of an overview and maybe look at some of the problems with how she defines her terms and maybe the implications of some of her philosophy. You could decide for yourself if it's a tight system. There are lots of people from both sides of the political spectrum that actually criticize some of her philosophy. So that's just a good example of a moral egoist. And the reason I brought her in, of course, is because she is a moral egoist and not a psychological egoist like, I was going to say David Hume, but like Thomas Hobbes. So you can see how you can have different perspectives. And what I'm going to finish up with in this last part of this lecture is just going back to hedonism and egoism and looking at some of the problems and critiques. And some of this I may have already done when we looked at the fact-value distinction, particularly dealing with this issue of Spinoza and identifying the good and things like that. So if you remember, hedonism is just this idea of identifying good and pleasure. If it's good, that means it's pleasurable. If it's pleasurable, that means it's good. Right? So the standard of goodness is going to be pleasure. Now, of course, the errors are going to be in identifying the good. The hedonist makes an error because he holds that the good is equivalent to pleasure. And, of course, pleasures vary from person to person. Therefore, good is going to vary from person to person. It's going to ultimately be subjective, and it's going to set up what is essentially a relativistic morality. Of course, that's not a problem in and of itself. We did see problems with relativism before. If that's true, that of course would follow. Spinoza also says, good is whatever is desired, and we looked at that a little bit and said, we could always ask the question, is it good because it's desired, or do we desire it because it's good? Which way does that actually go? There are apparent goods that we desire because they appear good. It doesn't mean they actually are good. So it does seem that to say something is good because it's desired is a little bit muddle-headed, right? Because I can desire things that are actually bad. So it's really difficult to define good with the word desire. That doesn't seem to follow. So seeing the problems or the errors, let's just maybe clarify a few things. So the hedonist view is really a simplistic view of happiness. It's identifying not only good with pleasure, but it's identifying happiness with pleasure. And we'll look at this in another lecture later on, a little bit more detail. We'll see essentially the same slide, but there's basically two views of happiness. The first view, and this would be the hedonist view, is that happiness is nothing other than a subjective experience or a feeling that we have. Okay? A more robust view of happiness is this other view, which says it's the subjective feeling, yes, but it's more than that. It also includes the true beliefs that cause that feeling. And that would be more along what Aristotle would hold to, because we can be wrong about being happy. We could think we're happy and actually not be happy if our beliefs don't line up with this subjective feeling. And we'll see how that might work out a little bit later. Okay, so that's one problem, is a simplistic view of happiness. Of course, here's another problem, is the hedonist can't really consider things like wealth, health, friends, wisdom, knowledge, as goods, because those things are themselves not pleasures, at least not in themselves, but may lead to pleasure, right? They cannot be desirable or desired on this view. It's impossible to maintain that the only thing one desires is pleasure, because, of course, we can think of desiring wealth, health, friends, knowledge, and wisdom. Now, Plato's simple test, I think, is a good way to dismantle this idea that pleasure is happiness or pleasure is good. When he asks the question, is a life of pleasure and wisdom better than a life of pleasure alone? So if you think about that for a second, if pleasure is happiness, then it would be hard to say that pleasure and wisdom, or if pleasure is good, it would be hard to say that pleasure plus wisdom is better than pleasure, because pleasure is the good. So you can't say wisdom adds something to the good to make it better, or there's another standard for good out there. I don't know if you're following that at all, but I think that kind of indicates that if you could say that wisdom plus pleasure is better than pleasure alone, then the standard that you're judging by is something other than pleasure itself, right? Also, there are some other obvious hedonists. Epicurus we've talked about before being a hedonist. John Stuart Mill, who we'll study later when we study utilitarianism, also a hedonist, have a little bit of inconsistency with maybe a simplistic hedonism, because they actually do distinguish pleasures between the higher and the lower. How do you rank a pleasure if there isn't some standard of good by which we rank them? What makes one pleasure higher or one pleasure better than another if pleasure is the standard? Okay, so both Epicurus' idea of distinguishing higher and lower pleasures and Mill's propensity to distinguish between more or less desirable pleasures tends to imply that there is a standard of goodness beyond pleasure itself. Essential distinctions in pleasures that we might be able to make. We can maybe classify pleasures into two types. We've got the sensual, and then we've got the satisfaction. Sensual pleasures would be the things that are objects of our desires when it comes to physical sensation, right? Of course, they're not the good, and they're not, of course, the only objects that we desire. Therefore, they're not the highest objects that we desire, because sometimes we're willing to suffer for certain things that we see as better, even though the suffering involves possibly a lack of sensual pleasure. Pleasure, too, is satisfaction. And that is something that we usually get when we fulfill a desire, right? That accompanies the attainment of a good, but it might not be identical to a good. So I could be satisfied when I attain something that I see as good. So the satisfaction is not the same thing as the good itself. And of course, pleasure and satisfaction also differ with respect to higher and lower pleasures. So if they differ, then again, how can they be standards of goodness? Which I was talking about, I guess, here too. Lower and higher goods. How, what's the basis for ordering them? We do disagree about these things. So if the good is simply what we desire, then it leads to relativism, as we stated. And people, of course, differ in their desires. So how do you avoid relativism? Way to avoid that, of course, is to go back to the Aristotelian view. And I'm not going to spend time on this, since we already spent a good bit of time talking about different types of desires. As Aristotle would point out, there are natural desires and there are acquired desires. And we said the natural desires have to do with our needs, things that are inherent in our human nature, things that are common to all people, things that will start us off on an even playing field, because all human beings have the same natural desires. And of course, fulfillment of those natural desires is always a true good or a real good. So whatever we desire is really good. And of course, we use this to try to derive a starting point for moral reasoning by coming up with a prescriptive judgment that we say is practical truth, as a way to argue from a moral principle through facts to the moral judgments that we make in our argumentation, which again was covered, I believe, in PowerPoint number 4. Okay. So one ought to desire things because we need them, and because of our needs, things are ultimately really good. And this slide goes back through the acquired desires, which are just our wants. They're not needs. They do differ from people to people, and they cannot be the basis by which we make any kind of moral principle. Okay. Now, that's enough on hedonism. It was a quick overview, just to give you a few problems with egoism to wrap up this lecture. And some of these will go back to the very beginning arguments that we looked at 2 lectures ago. So first problem is that egoism really has no means to settle a conflict of interest without appealing to some other system. You know, what happens when my self-interest conflicts with your self-interest? You know, where do we go to resolve that conflict? Is it just a struggle of power, right? Because then, of course, we're, you know, going into this whole idea of physical violence, of course, Rand would be opposed to. So to resolve the issue, the egoist has to resort or reassert just a simple premise of self-interest, and therefore it becomes very circular. Well, this is my self-interest. No, this isn't my self-interest. Back and forth you go. Ultimately, violence is going to lead to a loss of freedom or something at some point. So really, you can't settle a conflict without some kind of higher principle to appeal to, which should get us beyond self-interest. Another problem is that egoism ultimately collapses into anarchy. If we're going to be consistently only pursuing our own self-interest, we could see how this might happen. Hobbes, who believed we just naturally do this, always pursuing our own self-interest, saw this, again, the state of nature, as a very big problem, where it's violence and dangerous, and nobody would want to live there, so we should give up some of our freedoms for some security through the social contract. Now, Hobbes actually advocated an absolute monarch to avoid that, some way to actually enforce the contract, to avoid this slide into anarchy, which he sees as following from the psychological egoism that we naturally manifest. Another thing is that egoism is arbitrary, in that it divides people into 2 groups without a really good reason for doing so. It says that one group, the interests of one group outweigh the interests of the other group. And I hope you can already think of what these 2 groups are. These groups would be me and everybody else. Okay? And there, of course, is no justification for treating another group differently if there are no relevant differences. As we saw, that's one of the moral principles that we need to start with. It's a principle of moral reasoning, at least, the principle of equality. So it seems to be arbitrary on that basis. You know, why am I any more important than anybody else, other than that I'm really, really special to myself? Another problem is that egoism is built on the false premise of psychological egoism in many places. Not that it has to be. As we saw, Rand outright rejects the idea of psychological egoism, but many egoists embrace it. And I said that it can be a little strange to say we're psychological egoists and then advocate moral egoism as if we had a choice, right? That we ought to do something that we just couldn't help doing anyways. Now, it's not true that individuals are only capable of acting for their self-interest. Okay, sometimes we do act spontaneously, again, with no motivation, possibly, or definitely without concern for our self-interest. Sometimes we do very foolish things spontaneously. And in our closest relationships, we often act sacrificially for the well-being of people that we tend to care about, which seems very altruistic. Egoists will say upon closer examination that that even that, right, this is Hobbes, that even that is ultimately motivated by self-interest. And here's where the problem is. Egoism ultimately becomes untestable, and we can't falsify it. And I don't remember if we did that in the last lecture or not, but this idea of not being able to falsify something makes something a fairly weak theory. It doesn't really count as a good theory if there's nothing that can count against that theory. And this is where we started the actual discussion on egoism, with the egoist defense of his general principles. We had this argument. So I want you to look at this argument. I highlighted certain parts in red just so that you might be able to pick up on where this argument seems to be bizarre. If you remember, it says, number 1, looking out for others is a self-defeating pursuit. That's your first principle. Of course, the reasons, concern for others invades their privacy, and people find it demeaning. So the argument that's then structured from this is, number 1, premise 1, we ought to do whatever promotes the best interests of others. Premise 2, this will happen best if we pursue our own interests exclusively, and therefore each of us should adopt a policy of pursuing our own interests exclusively. All right. So the first premise, that we ought to do whatever promotes the best interests of others, is where we start the argument. But of course, that principle assumes altruism, right? Acting in the best interests of others. And this is where it might seem bizarre. Does it sound strange to you? altruism lies behind this particular egoist argument, in which case the egoist has to be an altruist already to get the argument started. Now, I don't know if that's actually the intention of the argument, is to prove that egoism on the basis of altruism, it seems to be kind of self-defeating, is what I'm saying. If the problem is that we're concluding egoism, but we're concluding that egoism is true based on an underlying principle of altruism, it would seem to, self-destruct. Perhaps, though, we might be able to understand the argument in a different way if we understand it this way, that it's only there, this argument, to persuade the altruist as to the truth of egoism. In and of itself, I think it does self-destruct. But if its mere job is persuasion, then you could see how if you are an altruist and you accept the first premise, which again, an egoist would not accept, but if you accept the first premise, you may merely be showing that your altruism should lead you to egoism. Okay, but again, the egoist doesn't have to accept the first premise, and therefore the argument doesn't have to work, or it actually doesn't work. So just an interesting way to look at things. So that kind of wraps up our discussion of egoism. I think that is plenty to cover on egoism. It's not one of the biggest topics that I even wanted to do, so I'm surprised that I got 3 video lectures out of this one topic. What we're going to pick up with from here, though, is we're going to be moving into divine command theory in our next session, and then we'll be moving on to what I think are the big theories, normative ethical theories, such as utilitarianism, Kantian deontological ethics, and then virtue theory, or virtue ethics. Though we're going to throw in natural law at the end as well, which is somewhat related to virtue theory. So egoism, fairly straightforward. I think you can grasp the basic gist of it, even if there's a lot of details that get lost along the way. It will become a little bit more complicated, like I said, when we get into specifically Kant and Aristotle, but I think I'm already priming you a little bit for Aristotle as we go. So good luck studying through these. Thank you again for joining me, and I will talk to you guys very soon.